The night had fallen heavy over the valley, and the small village slept under a sky crowded with stars. In one of the narrow alleys, between mud walls and silence, a man stumbled forward, his face drawn, his hands trembling, and his eyes carrying a kind of desperation only hunger and fear can create. He was an Apache, a proud man who once carried himself like the wind that runs free over mountains, but now his steps were broken, his dignity strained, because clutched in his arms was a tiny bundle, a child, his son, crying with a hunger too deep to be soothed by rocking or lullabies. The boy's lips were pale, his small fists weak from exhaustion, and every sob pierced the father like a knife. He had nothing left to give. No bread, no water, no milk. Nothing. The desert had taken everything from him except the love that kept him moving. He went door to door, knocking gently at first, then harder, calling out in a voice that cracked with both shame and urgency. "Please," he whispered, "milk for my boy, just a little." Many doors remained shut. Some people peered out from behind their curtains, muttering about who he was, suspicious of his presence, afraid of giving too much or simply unwilling to be involved. He was an outsider, a wanderer whose skin and speech marked him as different. To them, he was someone whose suffering was not theirs to carry. The man's heart grew heavier with every door that closed in his face, and his son's cries grew weaker, fading into a silence that terrified him more than the hunger itself. Finally, he reached the edge of the village, where a small house stood alone, modest and warm with the faint glow of a candle in the window. He hesitated, his pride almost forcing him to turn away. He had always been taught that a man endures, that he suffers quietly. But the soft whimper in his arms reminded him this was not about his pride, it was about survival. He knocked. Once. Twice. The door opened slowly, and standing there was a young woman, her hair tied back, her face gentle but tired, as though life had tested her as well. She looked at him without fear, only curiosity, and her eyes immediately fell on the baby. "What do you need?" she asked softly. The words broke him. His voice shook, his throat dry from begging. "Please, milk. My son is starving. I have nothing to give him. He will not survive the night." For a moment, silence hung in the air. She could have turned him away like the others, but something in the way the child's tiny chest rose and fell stirred a memory deep inside her. Her own child, born months ago, had not survived. She had buried him with her own trembling hands, and the grief had left her hollow. Yet her body still carried milk, a cruel reminder of the baby she no longer held. For weeks, she had woken at night, her chest aching, hearing phantom cries that were never answered. She had prayed for meaning, for a reason she was still alive while her baby was gone. And now, here on her doorstep, stood a man begging, holding a child whose life still trembled between earth and sky. She stepped back and whispered, "Come in." The Apache hesitated, his eyes wet with both gratitude and disbelief. She reached out, her arms steady, and carefully took the baby from him. The child's cries grew faint as though he sensed a comfort he had been denied. She sat down, cradled him close, and without another word, she gave him what he desperately needed. The room filled with silence except for the sound of the child nursing, a fragile sound, like life itself being poured back into a broken vessel. The man stood frozen, his heart pounding, his pride gone, replaced by a humility so deep he could hardly breathe. When the baby finally closed his eyes and drifted into sleep, peace softening his tiny features, the woman looked up at the Apache. "He is safe now," she said. And in that moment, something shifted. She was not merely feeding a child, she was becoming his mother, in the way love makes families where blood cannot. Tears spilled down the man's cheeks. He fell to his knees before her, not as a warrior but as a father overwhelmed. "You saved him," he whispered. "I had nothing left, and you saved him." The woman shook her head gently. "No. He saved me too." She had thought her heart was buried with her lost child, but this tiny boy's breath against her chest awakened something she thought she would never feel again. A second chance. A reason to nurture, to love, to live. From that night on, she became part of their lives. Each day, the Apache returned, bringing small offerings, firewood, water, whatever he could find to repay her kindness. But the woman asked for nothing. She welcomed them, not as guests but as family. The baby began to grow stronger, his cheeks filling, his eyes shining brighter with each passing week. The villagers who once turned their backs began to whisper, then to wonder. They had closed their doors out of fear and prejudice, but here was a bond forming between strangers, a bond of humanity that defied divisions. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, the Apache spoke quietly to the woman. I was ready to lose him. That night, I thought it was the end. But you gave him more than milk. You gave him life. You gave me hope. She smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. And he gave me back my heart. You see, I thought I had nothing left to give. But love does not run out, it only grows. Their story spread slowly through the village, carried by whispers, by the sight of the child thriving, by the way the woman and the Apache walked together now, no longer strangers but bound by something sacred. People began to see that compassion was not a weakness, but the strongest thread holding humanity together. They realized that to give, even when it hurts, is to be more fully alive. The baby grew, and so did the bond. He would never remember the night his father knocked desperately on a stranger's door, but he would grow up surrounded by the love of two parents, one by blood, the other by choice. And the villagers who once shut their doors? Many of them came forward later, ashamed but changed, offering help, food, clothing. They learned that kindness is not about who deserves it, but about who needs it. Years later, when the boy was old enough to understand, his father told him the story. You lived because a woman gave you more than milk, she gave you her heart. Remember this always, true strength is not in taking, but in giving. The boy listened, his small hand resting in the woman's. She smiled, her soul healed in ways she could never have imagined. And so, what began with a desperate knock on a door became the story of a family born not from blood alone, but from compassion, sacrifice, and the courage to open one's heart. It was proof that sometimes the greatest love is found in the most unexpected places, that a stranger can become a mother, and that humanity, at its best, is not divided by walls, but united by acts of mercy that echo forever. In the end, the Apache had come begging for milk, but what they all found was something far greater, the reminder that in giving life to another, we often find life returned to us. And that is how one act of compassion turned despair into hope, strangers into family, and loss into love, leaving behind a story that would be told for generations, inspiring hearts to believe that kindness is the strongest legacy we can ever leave behind.